Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar with a focus on the theme of books and belonging. Thanks ever so much for joining us this evening. No doubt you are coming to the session following a busy afternoon, and maybe it all feels later in the day for us with the evenings drawing in as well. So thank you for joining us, for your support for this event, but also for the English in Education SIG. My name is John Gordon. I'm a co-convener for the English in Education SIG with Andy Goodwin, and we're delighted that you can join us for this first online webinar for the SIG in some time, and certainly since the pandemic and everything that's affected us so drastically since. So yeah, we're delighted to welcome you to this webinar. In a moment, I'll talk a little bit about the theme for today, but I'd just like to share a few details about the remit of the English in Education group, given this is one of the first opportunities we've had to join together in an online forum like this, aside perhaps from if you've been able to join during the BERA annual conference. So yeah, we're delighted to be joined by panelists today in a forum where we can explore aspects of English in education. And in terms of the remit of the SIG, that means English as a subject, not just across the UK, of course, but also globally. And also the remit of the group involves broader understandings of language literacy, learning, and literary study as well, with some overlap, of course, with drama education, media education, really the range of different conceptions of the subject that we find across the world, and also that we found historically. It's always a contested area, one around which there's often controversy as well about where we mark the boundaries of what subject English is. Of course, although our focus is around those areas, if you like, the discipline of English and those related fields, clearly that there's always overlap and complement with broader educational issues such as assessment, inclusion or teacher development, many of those areas that are also represented by BERA with their own independent special interest groups. So everything that we share here is a complement to those activities. And again, if you join from involvement in other special interest groups, welcome to this group. I think many of us are involved and certainly interested in the activities that occur across different SIGs. But for this group, no doubt everyone here shares a belief and a commitment to the importance of English in education in its many different forms. And of course, I think we've all had cause to reflect over the last few years on the importance of English, what it can be, what it maybe should be in response to the global challenges we've faced, whether that's the pandemic, climate crisis, but also how the subject responds to the aims and achievements of social movements, for example, Black Lives Matters, and of course that's a movement that colleagues joining us today from the Lit in Colour team have made connections with in their report as well. So we're very lucky to have colleagues from the Lit in Colour team with us this evening to talk about the report. And of course, the seminar takes its lead from a statement in the early pages of the Lit in Colour report. And if I just share that with you, it begins: books create belonging. They help us see and understand one another. They shine a light on the world. It matters profoundly that the books we read in our formative years reflect the rich diversity of the society we live in. And I think that's a great starting point for our discussions this evening. We're also joined by a colleague of mine, Sarah Brownsword, who's going to talk about research, particularly as it relates to place, but with close links with the work of the Lit in Colour team. I'll speak in a little bit of time about the format for the session as well. But just before we do that, I'd just like to invite colleagues on our panel this evening to introduce themselves briefly to the wider group. So if I start with colleagues from the Lit in Colour team, and over to you, please, Zahida. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Zahida Nabagerika. I'm Head of Social Impact at Penguin Random House, but when I first joined Penguin Random House, I was Lit in Colour Programme Manager. So I'm going to be talking to you and giving you a bit more context about the campaign as a whole, and then my colleagues Velda and Rose will be talking to you more about the research itself.
Thanks very much, Zahida, and over to Rose.
Hi everyone, I'm Roseanne Shanty-Luke. I'm currently an exec director of a small educational services company in Oxford called Centre for Tutorial Teaching. But before I was put in that position, I was a contributor to the Lit in Colour report. And before that, I was an organising member of the Rose Must Fall campaign back when I was a literature student myself at the University of Oxford. And I contributed to the Rose Must Fall campaign's book as an editor in 2018. So hopefully trying to tie all of these different pieces of my experience together in the statement and ensuing discussion today.
Thanks, Rose. Velda.
Hello, excuse me. Hello, I'm Velda Elliott and I am Associate Professor of Literacy and English Education. English and Literacy Education at the University of Oxford. Terrible, can't even get my own job title right. And I am the Lit in Colour research lead, as well as being someone who is very interested in the teaching of literature in other contexts and other ways.
Thanks very much, Velda. And now Sarah, please.
Hi everyone, I am Sarah Bransford. I'm a lecturer in education at the University of East Anglia, where I'm course director on the primary PGCE and I lead the English components of that course and also the primary languages specialism. And I have an interest in reading for pleasure and children's literature and in issues related to race and ethnicity in education. So my doctoral research combines these interests. I'm in the final year of a 5-year part-time EdD, where I'm researching the use of diverse children's texts in primary schools in a predominantly white area. So mostly Norfolk and a little bit of Suffolk as well.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for those introductions. Okay, so in terms of the webinar format, we'll hear from each of the colleagues you've just met around about 5 minutes each. It might be a bit more flexible than that, but each will focus on a particular area of their research around the theme of books and belonging, and then after we've heard from each colleague, we'll open it into a first phase of discussion between the panelists, and again that will be of around 15 or 20 minutes, and then after that we'll open to the floor and your questions for discussion as well. Of course, while colleagues make their statements or indeed during the discussion between panel members, please feel free to add questions to the chat, and of course that's really helpful for colleagues just to see what particular areas interest you or what you'd like to explore in conversation during the later phases of the webinar as well. So we have that broad format, and you'll hear from each of the panelists in the order that we've met everyone through the introductions. So I think we're ready to begin. So if I hand over first of all to Zahida, just to give an outline first of all of the Lit in Colour project. Thank you.
Great, so hopefully everyone can see my slide. So yeah, List Colour is a Penguin campaign that we run in partnership with the Runnymede Trust. It started in 2020 and it is all about supporting schools to make the teaching and learning of English literature more inclusive. Now, when we started this campaign, we realised, we are not experts in education. What we are experts in is books. We have lots of fantastic books. Some of them are on curriculums, some of them are not. But we really wanted to understand, what was happening at a school level. And John has already mentioned, the impact of Black Lives Matter. We saw lots of students taking to Twitter, taking to social media, asking exam boards, asking their teachers, why am I not studying communities that look like mine? Why am I not studying about people that look like me and my friends? And that's, quite significant when we have an engaged population of young people that want to be learning more about, this country, about themselves. And English is such a fantastic subject to do that with. So in partnering with the Runnymede Trust, the first phase of the campaign was all about understanding what was happening in schools in England from Key Stage 2 all the way up to A level. I'm not going to focus on that because that is what Velda and Rose are going to be speaking about. I'm going to talk more about kind of where we're at now, because we are now very much into the second phase of the campaign, now that the research is out into the world. And coming back to kind of what Penguin's input is, as the largest publisher in the world, we realized that, we have a stake in this. If we really want to see things improve for the next generation, we're aware that there's more we can do in terms of creating resources, in terms of making donations for our books, but also supporting exam boards to help make that change as well. Since the publication of the research in June 2021, Pearson, Edexcel and OCR have come on board as named partners, but we've also brought on named partners in publishers. Oxford University Press and Bloomsbury have also joined, because in reading the research, they realised, okay, we actually have a stake in this too, and there's more that we can contribute to this multifaceted, complex challenge. In the work that we've been doing with our exam board partners, it really is about thinking how we can get books to their centres and make life easier for the teachers that are having to, think about making these changes with confidence. Pearson Edexcel, we have an incentive program that we call the Pearson Pioneers Program. It's basically a program that takes away all the barriers which we know teachers currently face when it comes to making these changes in the classroom. And it's all about seeing what happens when you do remove those barriers. In the first year, which was last year, we brought on board 100 schools and about 12,000 learners. And this year we brought on board another 100 schools and about just over 11,000 learners. So we can see that, the appetite for change is real, it's there. And in terms of what, we're offering schools, it is access to books, it's access to CPD, but it's also, opportunities to actually engage with the writers, for students and teachers to engage with writers of colour and ask them questions about, their writing practice, what they really were thinking when they wrote a certain character. And I think that's also a really important thing when we think about, normalising Black and brown people in the curriculum. Actually having access to an author of colour is really significant. That will stay with the student. And just going back to one of the events that we put on with Malorie Blackman with Pioneers Schools, that's a moment that is huge. Malorie Blackman is one of our biggest, if not our biggest, Black female, writer in this country. And for her to be speaking about her book, Boys Don't Cry, which is on Pearson Edexcel's specification, is a really significant thing in a child's life. And we actually we made a small documentary film where we went to a school that was studying Boys Don't Cry. And the way that the young students that were actually going through that qualification were engaging with it was fantastic. So that's another aspect that we realise we are best placed to facilitate, actually bringing authors into schools and giving young people access. Another aspect that we have been creating kind of outside of the actual research is resources. We know that teachers are time poor and that there are a lot of fantastic books out there by writers of colour, but they don't have resources. So we've been working with lots of freelance teachers to create free resources that are available online through Twinkle. That is a new partner that we are working with to create teaching resources at primary level. And then we also have been working with TES on their Black Experiences Hub to have a whole suite of resources that are, again, freely downloadable. And most of those ones are geared towards Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5. One of the main things that we've also found, though, is that there is a significant lack of subject knowledge when it comes to knowing about books by writers of colour. So again, this is an area where we have lots of fantastic writers of colour, and our Lit in Colour Incomplete list is one of our most popular resources for teachers. It's publisher agnostic, so we're not just talking about Penguin authors, we're talking about a whole host of other authors from other publishers. But the point is, we've tried to make life easier for teachers by bringing over 100 texts into one list. That we've got one for primary, one for secondary, to give them a bit of an idea of, okay, maybe this is a book I could take into the classroom. Maybe this is a book I could suggest to a student who, is looking for something to read in their spare time. And in creating these lists, we have really found that it has given teachers more confidence. It's given them, even reading challenges in certain departments that they can go away and look at over the summer. Alongside the report launch last year, though, we also created some resources around having the conversation around what is our, English providing in our schools. And these are resources where there's an audit tool where schools are encouraged to actually look at what is currently being taught and think about if this is appropriate for their cohorts, but then also actually have a conversation at SLT level. We realized that when we published the research in 2021, there's some really groundbreaking statistics in there which shocked a lot of people. Not everyone, some people, and the lights are going down. But there's more that we wanted to do and make it easier for teachers. So this is a significant area of work that we're continuing to focus on kind of within the space that we have convened as a founding partner. I'm going to stop there, but one of my main questions that I kind of want to put to the group is how can we empower teachers to confidently talk about race in the classroom? And I don't just mean in the works by writers of colour, but actually by white writers, our heritage writers, because they are also engaging with race. And that's something I'm particularly interested in because I think this is one of the most difficult bits of this issue. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thanks very much, Zahida. And if we hand over now to Rose, who I know will make some strong links with what you've just shared with us as well. Thank you.
Everyone, so I'm just going to share my screen. Can you all see that visual? I hope you can. John, can you just confirm maybe you can see this?
Yes, thanks, Rose. Yeah.
Perfect. So just kind of dialing back the timeline a bit to 2020, 2021, which is when I was closely involved in the Lit in Colour research. I was participating in the research on two fronts. So the first front was really around doing a grey literature review. So really having a look at the state of the nation and what the larger conversation around race, ethnicity and identity in England, in the UK, how that conversation was being shaped, how the public discourse around that was being shaped, and how the broader Lit in Colour research report would sit into that conversation. On the second front, I conducted a bunch of qualitative interviews with teachers up and down the country, as well as with ITE, so initial teacher education, providers and instructors and tutors, including John, actually. I actually interviewed John as part of that process and absolutely loved that process and learned a great deal. A great deal of that data, of course, kind of fed into the report and fed into the key findings, some of which I'm displaying right now. Now, I won't go through them all and talk through them all because I would certainly monopolize the time of this session. But what I am going to do is just speak to some of the pieces on this visual that speak particularly to the teacher perspective and some of the impressions and questions that really struck me over the course of the qualitative interview process. So just to kind of situate the English teacher in the broader workforce context, if we look at this orange bucket up here, a lot of us know that the teaching profession in England is overwhelmingly white. However, over the course of the research, it was suggested that actually in English, when it came to English language teaching and literature teaching, that there are even lower levels of ethnic diversity, with 3/4 of teacher survey respondents say that they'd never been taught English by a Black, Asian or minority ethnic teacher. So that kind of means is for a lot of young people and a lot of students, their formative experiences of encountering literature for the first time are being nurtured and stewarded and ushered by white teachers. And that is significant, in terms of associating the study of literature and grappling with themes, it's a really kind of significant thing to kind of think about, really. In terms of how those teachers are being prepared from an IT point of view, I want to point your attention to this green bucket here. This is quite a shocking statistic. So only 12% of secondary teacher and only 13% of primary teacher respondents said that they had had training, explicit training on how to talk about race as part of their initial teacher training. So we have an overwhelmingly white English literature teaching workforce who in their initial education journeys are not being equipped necessarily with the tools, the language, the context, the historicization to really grapple with race in the classroom. And then when they get to the classroom and are potentially thinking about diversifying their literature teacher offerings, there are a lot of obstacles that can come in their way. And I know Zahida has already mentioned this, the great work that Penguin is continuing to do to kind of combat some of those obstacles. But overwhelmingly, the teacher respondents in the interviews were saying that time, money, subject knowledge, and overall teacher confidence, they were real barriers in their to their efforts in trying to diversify their literature teaching offerings. So in terms of time, as Zahida said, teachers are time poor, and actually the way that a lot of teachers were talking about diversification of literature text, it made it seem as if it was a really big lift that demanded a lot of time, a lot of capacity, a lot of headspace that just wasn't available. Teachers weren't able to see that there were sort of low-hanging fruit or small actions and gestures that could be done day to day. They were seeing like, oh no, diversification is this massive project and we just don't have the time, and it's going to be a distraction from the day-to-day rigors of classroom teaching. Money, of course, there's just little resources, and that situation is getting worse. There's resources are few and far between to really support teachers in actually buying new texts and resources to support the study of those new texts. Subject knowledge, and that can be understood in different ways depending on the sort of phase of teaching we're talking about. So when talking to primary teachers, they were just talking about subject knowledge in the broadest of terms, in this real sort of sense that they didn't have deep enough knowledge about some of the themes that were coming up in potentially diverse literacy texts. They were talking about themes like race, identity, ethnicity, and how to really talk about that to primary level students in a way that does justice to the text, whilst also sort of trying to deepen conversations with students at that level. And they just didn't feel like, as generalists, they had deep enough subject knowledge at that level. When talking to secondary teachers, it was more about knowledge of the text themselves. Overwhelmingly at secondary level, there was this real sense of, we have taught a handful of texts for over generations, we know them really well, there's a sense of data control and quality control in terms of GCSE results that we can kind of benchmark year to year when teaching those same texts. Introducing new texts means learning new texts and learning them well and knowing them inside out. And when grappling with questions around themes with identity, race, and ethnicity, it also brought up other areas of subject knowledge for teachers around historical context, language, theory, and teachers really being bogged down with the sense of, I need to be an expert on all these things to do justice. And I felt that particularly for the overwhelmingly white teaching profession when it comes to English literature, it felt like there was a real fear of getting things wrong in that regard. So subject knowledge and teacher confidence kind of going hand in hand in terms of, who am I to kind of speak on the subjects of race, ethnicity, identity when it comes to texts. Overall, there was a sense that teacher confidence in this is just really low. But there were some certain nuances depending on which teachers you were talking to, which key stages they were teaching, and which areas of the country they had either taught in before or were teaching in at that time. So, for example, whenever I spoke to a teacher who was from London and who was working in an inner city school with a plurality of ethnicities in terms of the student body, they felt more confident just kind of talking about race day to day. Whereas when I was talking to teachers in the Northeast and the Northwest, in sort of mono-ethnic schools, they felt very much like it wasn't for them to really spearhead those conversations. It was very interesting when speaking to teachers in Cornwall, where they had a very broad and nuanced and almost inherently intersectional understanding of diversity, and really factoring in Cornish identity into that conversation about diversity, and thinking about class consistently alongside race, and not kind of distracting away from conversations around race and identity, but folding it in like I said, a kind of inherently intersectional way. So it was very interesting that different types of teachers, depending on where they were in the country and who they were teaching, felt that they knew different types of, that they had different types of knowledge and different types of confidence when it came to this issue. So with all of that in mind, my question to the group is really around teacher preparation. How do we equip teachers at the initial teacher training and initial teacher education phase? And what are the best practices for ensuring that teachers do have explicit training on how to talk about race as part of their initial teacher training? I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much indeed, Rose. And now to Velda.
Thank you. So I think that it's quite important to acknowledge that a lot of the conversations that we've been having around Lit in Colour have been being had for a long time, and it feels like there's just been a moment when there was enough of a critical mass of people talking about it, and I don't think we can deny the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement and sadly the death of George Floyd in starting to make those conversations much more mainstream all over the world, but in the UK. So I think it's important to acknowledge that this seems to have just been a moment. And I think one of the positive things I'd like to say is that since Lit in Colour, there's definitely been a sense of movement, and all sorts of exciting things are starting to happen all over the place. And so I just want to touch on a few of the kind of things, the developments that have happened since we published the report, and kind of think about how books and belonging are moving forward in this country at the moment. So one of the things to talk about is the Pioneers project. So Pearson Edexcel, who to their credit had already changed their GCSE texts before Lit in Colour came about, have this project with which we're collaborating with them called Pearson Pioneers, where they are bringing on, which Zahida mentioned, where they're bringing on schools to those particular texts by authors of colour at GCSE and or A level. And I just want to kind of emphasize, we bring together the fact there are 12,000 students in that first 100 school cohort, and that less than 1% who answered on the text by an author of colour in GCSE in 2019, that first year of Pioneers will quadruple the number of students in this country who are studying a text by an author of colour at GCSE. And that's just a phenomenal number and a phenomenal kind of move and action that they've been able to make a difference. Of course, it's because it comes from a very slow starting point, but it has been a really tremendous project. And one of the other things that we had noticed when we were doing the Lit in Colour project was that there was surprisingly, or possibly not surprisingly, there was extremely little research on the effects of studying texts with protagonists of colour, by authors of colour. And we are working with Pearson Pioneers to do some research with those schools who are coming on board. And it is phenomenally difficult, as many of you will know, to do any kind of causal research that demonstrates a change in achievement is down to any one thing. So that's not what we're doing. We're not going to come out and say, pick a book by an author of colour for your GCSE and you'll be able to improve the number of 9s you get tenfold. But we are looking to see what the experience is through some qualitative research, so talking to teachers and students about the experience of doing this and how it makes them feel, how it has affected them, but also some quantitative survey-based research looking at attitudes to school, attitudes to English, and also some measures of empathy and measures of cultural awareness, cultural competence, and some other things to do with kind of essentially what is called fantasy, but is essentially a case of imagining the world as something other. And I think that's I kind of a hat tip to Maxine Greene, the American sociologist, who talks about the social imagination, the importance of being able to imagine the world as other than it is in order to be able to affect any kind of change. So that's one thing that we're doing. The other thing is to say that it's really pleasing now that all of the major exam boards in England have come out and announced changes to their texts for GCSE and A level. And one of the really interesting things is the change in the kinds of texts that are being announced. So Matthew Courtney, who's in the audience, hi Matthew, who was my research intern at the time that we were working on this, and is a co-author on the Lit in Colour report. He and I did some deeper work looking at the poems that were named by respondents to the survey. And what we found is that the vast majority of those poems focus on kind of issues of identity or being a migrant or the difficulty of language barriers and all that, and those kind of things. So it kind of felt that in order to become part of the curriculum, if you were an author of colour, you had to be kind of really focused on that in the text that you were being invited into the classrooms with. And what's really interesting is that the new texts across the board seem to be moving away from that framing. Then you no longer have to be writing about race in order to be an author of colour in the classroom. And I think that's a really positive, wonderful move, that you know, you're not just being invited in as a token of who you are, but because you've written something really amazing, and we want to kind of appreciate that. So that changing in framing is really heartening. I've now run out of time, but I'm going to mention two things. One is that I think the other thing that's kind of happened in the last few years, so in 2015, when we had the massive change in GCSEs and the complete change in all GCSE and A-level curriculum, a lot of schools moved of mice and men back from Key Stage 4 into Key Stage 3 because they had the books, they had the materials, they knew how to teach it, and they wanted to keep as much as possible the same because they were having to rewrite much of their GCSE and A-level schemes of work. And I feel like over the last couple of years, since Lit in Colour, principally since Black Lives Matter, people have started to have bedded in the changes in GCSE and A-level, but also to kind of think, well, maybe Mice and Men is not the text that we want. And when I'm hearing people talk about what they're doing, they're quite often changing it for a text by an author of colour, and there's various things that people have picked, including Akala's novel, The Dark Lady. And also actually The Empress by Tanika Gupta, which is a play rather than a novel. But so people are beginning to change, and I think that's a really positive kind of note to start on, to kind of end on, is that things are moving, and it's really nice to see that. And I feel like we've had this conversation before, but perhaps things are moving in a way that they haven't before.
Thank you very much, Velda. And that focus on choice of texts, I know, is something that Sarah has been considering as well. So over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, John. So yeah, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I've been doing research with teachers in schools, mostly in Norfolk, and a few over the border in Suffolk, looking at the children's books that are being used in primary schools. So just as a way of context, briefly, 81.8% of children in Norfolk schools are white British, according to the most recent school census data. 7.8% are from other white backgrounds, so mostly European backgrounds, taking white children up to almost 90% in Norfolk schools. Then we've got 3.8% who are from mixed backgrounds. That's quite high compared to other areas. 2.3% are unclassified, whatever that means. And then we've got 2.1% from Asian groups and only 1.3% from Black groups. And I think that this context is important for my research because a lot of the discourse around representation in children's books is about children seeing themselves in texts. A lot of the research that's been done at primary level has been in schools with very diverse populations. Most white children in Norfolk schools and other areas like it see themselves in books all the time, but they may not meet children who are different from them anywhere other than in books. So it's really important that diverse texts are being read and used in primary schools in predominantly white areas, and that the teachers that are working in those areas have really good subject knowledge of diverse books. So the teachers that I've been working with, I asked them to tell me what books they'd read with their classes recently, which contained characters from minority ethnic backgrounds. And this data was collected in spring 2021. So in terms of picture books, the kind of top 5 books that were mentioned were Hand of Surprise by Eileen Brown, Ruby's Worry by Tom Percival, Look Up by Nathan Byron, Easy Gizmo by Pip Jones, and The Proudest Blue by Ibtihaj Muhammad and S.K. Ali. And then in terms of novels, the top 5 were The Boy at the Back of the Class by Anjali Q. Ralph, Holes by Louis Sachar, High Rise Mystery by Shana Jackson, Cloud Busting by Mallory Blackman, and Amazing Grace by Mary Hoffman. So out of those 10 books, half of them are own voices texts and half of them are not. So own voices texts are books who are written by authors who are the same ethnicity as the characters that they are creating. So I also asked the teachers about the ethnic backgrounds of authors, and it was apparent that many of them didn't know which texts were own voices, or they presumed that the author would have the same ethnicity as the characters that they were writing about. So Hand of Surprise is a good example of this. Several of the teachers that I spoke to were really surprised when I told them that Eileen Brown is a white British woman and not from Kenya. And this question seemed to be dismissed as unimportant by some teachers. Others told me that the author was less relevant to them than the characters and the story. So that's one of the questions that I kind of have for everybody today is, does it matter if a text being used in a primary school where there's much less focus on and study of the author themselves is an own voices text or not? And if it does matter, then how do we support primary school teachers in developing this knowledge and understanding? So one of the other things that I've been looking at is some of the frameworks that already exist to critically examine diverse texts. And I've been reading children's books and looking at the frameworks alongside them. And they're a really useful way to ensure that the books that teachers are choosing include characters who have power and agency in their story, for example. So all of the frameworks that I've looked at are slightly different. Some are aimed at picture books, some are aimed more at novels. But one of the things that they all tend to include is reference to stereotypes, avoiding books which stereotype a specific race or culture or an element of that. And I hadn't really questioned this until I read a book called Little Bad Man and the Invasion of the Killer Aunties, which is by Humza Arshad and Henry White. And in this comedy book, which is aimed at children of around 8 years old, most of the characters are of British Pakistani background. And the author has talked about basing the character on himself as a child. So in the story, aliens take over Humza's town and school by taking over the bodies of all the aunties who spend all their time cooking and feeding up the children ready to eat. And the reason in the story that no one notices this happening is because that's what aunties do anyway. So the humour in this story relies on this stereotype or caricature of the Asian auntie. And actually that auntie stereotype exists in many other cultures too. So it's instantly recognisable for many different children. And comedy as a genre is one that's really lacking in diversity compared to other genres for this age group. And it's one that often relies on stereotypes, which we then recognise and then can share in that humour. But I can think of other children's comedy books that contain racial stereotypes, which are really offensive. So my other question here is about where is the line when it comes to stereotypes in comedy? Is that again about own voices, or is it down to maybe the subtle differences in the way that caricatures are used and portrayed? Is it about using caricatures alongside fully developed characters? Is it just that this book had better writing? And then I'm thinking about how we can adapt these existing frameworks, which often tell teachers to avoid stereotypes and caricature, to a kind of more nuanced approach that can help teachers to make good choices about the books that they're reading with children. So those are the kind of two main things that I'm thinking about at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, and thank you again to everyone who has shared a statement on the panel. So we move now to exploring the questions that panelists have posed there. So I've just tried to offer a brief summary in the chat as well as a reference point. And I think if we work back from focus on texts that Sarah has left with us and then move towards those, if you like, those system issues, if you like, around teacher preparation and how we conceive of the teacher's responsibility and agency around texts. We can move in that direction, but begin with texts themselves. So if members of the panel would like to turn on their cameras and we can see, or everyone in the webinar can see our shared discussion. So yeah, would you like to share that question again, Sarah, and then we can follow from there?
Yeah, so my question is about how much own voices matters. And if it does matter, if it is really important, then how do we kind of get, particularly primary school teachers, where there is much less focus on the author in primary, to develop that subject knowledge and to kind of see its relevance?
So I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if it does matter, but I think it's quite interesting. We also found in our data that lots of particularly primary, but actually also at secondary as well, people were naming texts that they were teaching that were by authors of colour, and they weren't. They were by white people. And Hand of Surprise is one particular one that I don't. And I think it's a classic text. It's a classic picture book, and it's almost the classic representation of Africa in picture books in this country. And of course, what's quite interesting about it is that it's a market. It focuses on the fruit. The focus is on animals. The presentation of Africa within it is a very particular presentation of Africa. And it is generically Africa, not anywhere kind of particular within Africa. And that, I think that is something which does matter, this kind of presentation and representation. Because I don't think it's not necessarily about then not mentioning that or not taking Hand of Surprise out of schools, but I think there is something there to be done about kind of then showing other images of Africa that show, the modern city life, and the kinds of the fact that not everyone's got a zebra stealing their fruit as they're on their way home.
Yeah.
So I think there's something there about not only about kind of thinking about what books we're teaching, but also how we handle the representation within them in the classroom.
Yeah, I was interested actually in what Zahida was saying about the lit in colour lists that you've created, because primary school teachers use lists a lot. There's a lot of, books lists that have been created for schools that schools use, which have, books for each year group, and they might have hundreds of books on them. And I've seen some of these, and in fact, that's one of the things I asked my teachers as well in this research: what book lists are you using? And when I've looked at them, some of them don't have any diversity in at all, or the only book that was in there that wasn't just white children in as characters, it was Hand of Surprise. So if schools are sticking to those lists, that might be the only place that they've ever kind of seen a black child. So yeah, I was interested in the kind of lists that you've created there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly important that we have as many people who are Black, Asian, and minority ethnic authentically writing stories, because that's the only way we're actually going to move the dial and not have stories about trauma, or not have stories which maybe trigger people. Having spent half of my life in East Africa, coming to then this country, I got asked, do you have elephants in your back garden? Are there monkeys, living with you? So, and a surprise, I feel, probably directly contributes to some kids thinking, oh, this is what it's like in Africa. Africa's a country. So that to me is hugely problematic. And if we think about, Amazing Grace, she suffers. Why does she have to suffer? She doesn't have to suffer. Let's have lots of new stories which are just about, people of color living, not suffering, just living. And I think we took real care with the list that we've created. We've got some new ones which will hopefully be published later this month that really do celebrate the broad range of what publishers, are now publishing sensitively, and really wanting to make sure that it is an authentic voice that's being put out there. And I think what we've done in our incomplete list is have a bit of a write-up so that teachers can think about, is this the right book? And in some of the write-ups, we put links to other books and kind of done a bit of like a review, so that again it becomes more than just, oh, I'm just going to pick this up. I'm actually going to think reflectively about if this is right. Yeah,
I think when you were talking about the list, Zahida, that was coming to mind. It's like the list being this empowering mechanism and tool that teachers can use to actually develop subject knowledge around the voices that are writing the stories. And so it's a subject knowledge toolkit builder essentially. And so I think it can be very, very empowering to have those lists that are a bit more nuanced, have a bit more information in them. And just to the point as well that Zahida was making about narratives of struggle, frankly, it kind of reminded me a little bit of what you were saying, Sarah, about the comedy at primary level. And then on one hand, you know, you've got comedy and which is varying on the stereotypical, and there are questions there. And on the other hand, particularly Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4, Key Stage 5, you've got a lot of very heavy text written by authors of colour. Then there's this risk of misrepresentation on either side. Right? Either you've got levity and comedy, but then there's misrepresentation in the form of stereotypes, or you've got this sort of political grappling around the systems of experience, and then you've got misrepresentation of struggle. And so I think the answer is nuance. It's like, how do you put those representations into conversation with other texts that aren't like that, and how do you use the stereotypes as like a teachable moment, depending on who you're talking to, of course. But those conversations can be scaffolded right the way down, actually, man. Like, why is this funny to you, and things like that. So I think there's a risk of misrepresentation on both ends, in terms of the stereotypical, but also the heaviness and the struggle on the other end too.
And just to add on to that, you know, the Centre for Literacy and Primary Education, their new Reflecting Realities report is going to be coming out soon, which again, for teachers that really want to go down this route, that's a fantastic way to engage with what is being put out there. How good actually is it? Because I think in last year's report, they said that we've had a fantastic increase in characters of colour, but that also means that there are two-dimensional characters, there are tokenistic characters, there are ones that actually are not fully formed, are not complex, and actually aren't that great. But then again, this kind of pushes the issue back onto, you know, the publishing side, and how are publishers going about sensitivity reads? How are we engaging new authors to be talking about these issues? So it's kind of like 5 steps forward, maybe 3 steps back, but at least we're going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's the point that you just made there about kind of, you know, not all representation is good representation. I think that's particularly true in picture books. There's been a massive increase in the publication and representation in picture books, because it's easy. It's easy to change the color of a character when it's visual, but that it's not necessarily done well in all cases.
And then I think that also goes back to, you know, what you were saying in your question in terms of harm. And for me, stereotypes, if it's not harmful, if it's funny, if it's joyful, like in Hamza Ashad's book, then that for me is okay. But when we cross the line into harm, that's when I think, and it becomes dangerous, and that's where we maybe need to be thinking about what books are people taking in, and what is the rationale for that.
I think also it kind of, if it's the only book, it matters a lot more than if it's one of many. And that, you know, we need more stories, we need different stories, we need a huge range, and for kids to be encountering more and different ones, so that it's not, you know, the one time that you see yourself in the curriculum is when you're doing a slave narrative, or, you know, or indeed not just yourself, but for, it's not just about children of colour being able to see themselves as protagonists, it's also about white children being able to see people of colour as protagonists. And I think that's something which is quite easy to overlook. And there are a few times you get pushback and people going, well, you know, my school's all white, why does this matter to me? And the answer is because those kids are going to live in a multicultural society, and they need to know about the other people in that society, even if they're not in their village right now.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I'm finding with the teachers. A lot of the teachers that I'm talking to don't see that it's relevant to them because they're in completely monocultural schools.
Thanks, everyone. We have the details around text choice there as well, and I wondered if there are any connections around best practice. Although actually, before we come to that, I could see a colleague just raised their hand there as well. Obviously, it might be a good moment to invite you to comment, Laura.
Thank you. Sorry, no, I didn't want to interject, and I realise that it's a panel discussion, but just a question that was hovering in my mind that is really relevant just to that that discussion you've just had there. Oh, sorry, I'll just introduce myself just really quickly. My name's Laura Dunster. I work at AQA Education, the exam board. But it was only just yesterday morning actually that I was having a discussion with a teacher who was very much I think she said she was in a school in the Norfolk area actually, and she was saying that her school is predominantly white, and they have a policy where they won't teach a text that has any kind of for example, Jamaican patois, because they feel that that is appropriating language, and it's just not appropriate. And I mean, I struggle with that, and I did challenge it, but it is a very valid question. And so I just kind of put this to the panel really as a challenge. How do we get around that? I mean, unless schools have access to an audio recording or a performance of that particular text, but that's not always going to be available. So I don't know. It was just a really interesting question. So I'll just put it out there, and you're welcome to, respond now or just put it in the bank for when we open up to broader questions. But it was just relevant, so I thought I'd say it now.
Thanks, Laura. I think, given that we're on texts, yeah, please over to the panel.
Oh, I have so many feelings. I think this is quite interesting also, actually, because I was really pleased to see in the new AQA cluster a poem by Liz Berry, the homing poem, I think it is, that's and it's intentionally talking about working class language and the minds and accent and dialect. And I think it's a really interesting question in schools at the moment, where we have this push for standard English, and that you should be speaking as you are. You're supposed to be teaching children to speak as they write in order to practice for writing in standard English, and all this. I think there is something really interesting in the tensions that then are elicited when we read any kind of text, which literary text which draws on something which isn't standard English, and not only, I mean, this is definitely something which has been historically relevant to the poems from other cultures, and the linguistic repertoire that those people use, and that those poets use. And there's all sorts of things that are really interesting about this, that are to do with the tensions inherent in the way that certain movers in government and in Ofsted are pushing for standard English in schools. And 99% of our students don't speak standard English at home.
I think that reminds me of one of the case studies in the report that I wrote, where one of the teachers was talking about how, particularly around the question of language in teaching literature, and the fact that when it comes to grappling with text and dealing with text, she just really lets the students express themselves in whatever feels comfortable to them, including in slang. And she understands that that's like a controversial choice, but speaking to what Valda was just saying then, it what better place to kind of talk about and grapple with that conflict there around standardized English and other forms of self-expression, and how that links to identity than in the English literature classroom. And if your study of literature can bring that to the fore in your students and also create a rapport in so doing, then that is a rich discussion. But it was interesting that the teacher I was talking to who takes that approach, she was faced with pushback on that approach. People think this is not what schooling is about, but it is what encountering literature in a nuanced and meaningful way is about. So in terms of the patois question, I think that whoever raised that question, whichever teacher is kind of concerned about appropriation or anything like that, I think as long as there's a sort of helpful and meaningful discussion around how that language is being presented, how it kind of confronts the linguistic status quo of what that means for the themes of the text, and it's not appropriative at all. It's a meaningful appreciation of expression.
Thanks very much, Rose. I could see another colleague has a hand raised. Diane, just before we hear your question, Diane, if please, other colleagues do feel free to add questions to the chat, and we'll obviously keep this momentum of discussion. So over to you, Diane, please.
Thank you, and lovely to be with you all. It's really heartening because I work at a university in initial teacher education, so I work with the undergraduates and the postgraduates, and my university is right in the centre of a massively diverse city, and we are on the edge of one of the poorest areas as well, and it's quite surprising how, you know, in our courses there was very little, if anything, in terms of educating the student teachers about diversity. And English is my subject, and I was a primary English teacher, so you're right, there are very few black and brown primary English teachers there. So and my PhD focused on that as well. So it's been a massive mission for me, and I've always been normally the only black teacher or teacher educator in all of my settings. So it's been very important to me. And when I've introduced things, I've tried to draw in colleagues, so it's not always sort of left to me as the person who's doing equality and diversity. We always push the fact that it's all of us being involved in this, whatever your background or your heritage. But when I do teach about text, and that's one part of my equality diversity work, although I teach other things as well, is that it's all about, as you said before, the children seeing themselves in books, and how that is almost the most important thing. And so I teach that with the student teachers, but it's also the student teachers seeing themselves and understanding, and it's part of that identity of them becoming teachers, and then how they model and work with children in their placements as well. And one of the things I did this year was I was teaching a new course, so of course I was introducing all of those areas, and I used Joseph Collio, the new children's laureate, and here's an example where he is writing poetry, not always about his experience as a black man of mixed race heritage. Actually, he's also writing poetry about other things. So I'm just picking up a point that was made earlier in terms of, yes, it doesn't always have to be about lived experiences and struggle and slavery and that. And yes, we definitely want poets and authors of all heritages to write sort of good quality literature. But I think it's both, because if black and brown authors and poets aren't writing about their experiences, no one else is going to. So it has to be both. But Collio is a lovely example. A young man of a mixed heritage, and you know, writing lovely poetry, primary level as well. And so, you know, hopefully my students really appreciated that. Hopefully they'll take his poetry into school when they're on placement and things like that. Thank you. So it's a point rather than the question.
I think you make a really important point there, and this speaks to this question about how to prepare teachers and how to empower teachers, is that one of the things that we can do in ITE is to change the text that we are using in our classrooms with our student teachers. And one of the things that's been really interesting, we changed a few years ago to have the Empress by Sneaker Gupta as our text for teaching planning, instead of Jekyll and Hyde, which we had been using, because lots of them teach Jekyll and Hyde wherever they go. And instead we chose this text which nearly no one in our no one in our partnership was teaching it at the time, and now it's popping up all over the place within our partnership. So they've taken this text into schools with them, they've gone and got jobs in these schools, and when people have said, well, what should we change in year 9, they said, oh, how about this? And I think you're right that you provide text to student teachers and they take them with them into their careers, and it just spreads in this kind of circle, of a fluffy circle, isn't it? Not a vicious circle, a fluffy circle.
Thanks, Velda. I wonder if that's a good point to move into that broader area of how we prepare teachers, and linked with that, of course, how we empower teachers. I just wonder, yeah, what panelists' thinking is around those two questions, because obviously they're very large questions to address, and I think we've already touched on issues, I suppose, for example, around identity in texts, but also about the identity of teachers and how they relate to the texts they're working with, how they relate to the schools and the communities they're working with as well. You have many complex relationships across different identities, I suppose, in any instance of teaching English.
This was a question that I raised, and I think it primarily came from the patterns that I was seeing from the teachers that I was speaking to, and where they were just talking about, we don't have the lived experience, we don't have the subject knowledge, we don't have the confidence. So I'm thinking, okay, so what do you have, and what do actually you need to be equipped with in the classroom to be able to feel like you can do this well, and how much of that is actually are actually things that you build in the classroom day to day, and how much is that can be a foundation set either through a sort of school placement oriented approach to teacher education or a PGCE sort of university based approach. And I wonder whether there are different kind of nuances around the types of preparation that can be given for teachers in that regard, depending on their route into initial teacher education.
I think this is something, you know, it's a huge question, but I think this is something that needs to be embedded throughout an entire IT program, that it can't just be something which sits within English or is part of, you know, a particular subject. It has to be that kind of anti-racist approach, has to be something which is just completely embedded throughout an entire IT courses, whether that's primary, secondary, whether it's university based, whether it's school based. Which is an really easy thing for me to say. Putting that actually into practice and making that happen is really difficult, because it's that not everybody who works in ITE has got the confidence or the experience or the subject knowledge to be able to do that. I'm just going to pop something in the chat. I don't know if everybody's aware of the new anti-racism framework for ITE, which has recently been developed. So this has been developed by Heather Smith at Newcastle University, along with Vinnie Lander at Leeds Beckett, and they kind of worked with myself and also lots of people from other universities to develop this framework, looking at kind of what people are doing already. It's got lots of really good resources in it, you know, as a starting point for ITE courses that don't really know where to start in this. And like I said, I think it's about, you know, it has to be done in a more general way before you can kind of bring it into those particular subjects.
No, I think that's spot on, and I think that resonates a lot with what some of the participants in the interviews were saying, that they just don't really have, even when I was speaking to IT tutors and specialists, they were saying actually it's quite difficult to have sight of what other colleagues in other institutions are doing. So things like this, again, lists as an empowering tool for subject knowledge and building confidence. It is true though, sometimes you those signposts and those case studies can either like create networks, let you know what's possible, give you some starting points. And I think as well, there's this almost like there's this attitude and a mindset piece around this work generally that I found, where people feel like it's such a heavy lift and a heavy project, and actually it's like, where do we begin? We need an expert, we need to get this person, and actually it's I wonder whether there's a case being said for thinking about things that can be done just day by day, things that can be done in sort of smaller gestures. And of course, you know, we do want these large scale changes, but I think sometimes the conversation around the large scale change can actually be off-putting to people who are feeling quite lacking in confidence already. So yeah, I completely agree with you, Sarah.
And that's, you know, kind of why we created, at the launch of the research last year, you know, a PowerPoint slide that all teachers can go and download for free, to have that conversation with their English departments, to have that conversation with SLT, to show the data and say, look, this isn't good enough. What can we do? And then combine that with the audit tool. That in itself, those are big steps, especially in terms of, you know, if awareness just hasn't been raised. And those are 3 things which we're trying to, you know, share with teachers and get them to a space where they don't feel it has to be, you know, what Rose has just said, these huge things that can actually start from tomorrow.
Thanks everyone. Is there anything else you'd like to pick up in relation to the statements you've given? Any other questions that you had in response to each other's presentations? Sorry, Valda.
Sorry, yeah, I realised I was muted. I feel like Zahida, Rose and I have had plenty of discussions over the years, so it's hard to think of anything that's particularly kind of fresh and coming out there. I think the one thing that actually I would like to pick up on that I didn't get a chance to talk about is to do with this kind of issue of text, thinking about race and whiteness, not just in text by author of colour, but in all texts. And I think that in particular, we have something which is quite dominated by 19th century literature at the moment, but also Shakespeare. And I think that's one of the real areas where we can, like, once you start looking at the 19th century texts that we teach, they are so saturated with empire that it's really ridiculous that we're not thinking about that. And I think I was talking to some colleagues about this last week, and when you start looking at A Christmas Carol, for example, this is taught nearly every Key Stage 3 across the land will do Christmas Carol. And if you start just thinking about food in that, and you start going, well, what would still be on that table if this wasn't the British Empire? And then kind of you take, they'd basically be eating, potatoes and carrots, essentially, is the kind of the Christmas dinner that would be left. And so there's lots of ways to think about and to bring this, to kind of recognise both the historical presence of Black and Asian people in this country, but also to acknowledge the kind of the ways in which this country has been shaped by empire and by connections across the globe for centuries. And I think that's really, that is something which is really interesting as well. And that's, again, one of the things that, what makes that connection. We know that students aren't that interested anymore in GCSE English as driving people out of the subject. But these are the things which make it fascinating. And, and you start thinking about the beginning of Jane Eyre, and all that darkness in the room is all like mahogany furniture, and the mahogany is coming from the empire, and that's all imported, and it's this oppressive state. There's so much there that we're English teachers. We love fascinating facts about texts, and that's something that we can transmit to students.
And I think, that's a really great point to actually take us back to Laura's question. Why are people in the Caribbean speaking English anyway? Why is patois there in the first place? And if you actually think about, linguistics a bit, which I think everyone should do, that in itself is a wonderful way to then come into the text and think, well, how do we feel about this? I mean, we get kids to read Chaucer all the time. I don't really know if anyone enjoys that very much, but we still get them to do it. So I think if there was a framing of it first, then I don't see a problem with asking kids to read out loud if you actually really understand, how has English as a language been used as a tool of oppression, as a tool, that we're still using around the world in former colonies. I think that in itself gives a really fantastic framing, to a text that uses patois.
Thanks, Zahida. I just wondered if no, you were responding there to Laura's question. Is there anything further you'd like to add, Laura, or just to come?
So Laura's added a question in the chat.
Okay.
About whether white students and teachers can or should read aloud accents and dialects that aren't their own in a safe space. And once anyone has heard John Agard read his poetry, it's absolutely impossible not to try and do an impression of him, because he's so good and so fun. But I think that the presence of video and the internet has been a wonderful gift. And I suspect that many of the GCSE classes that I enforced my impression of Tom Leonard doing my Scottish accent from I'm not even going to try it. I'm not going to do it in public. But I think that they can only be grateful for the fantastic performances that are now easily available in every classroom.
I would agree with that. The revelation of technology for those sorts of things, I think, is really helpful. To give a kind of counter example of like bad practice regarding that, I remember being like asked specifically to read out patois in the classroom among my white peers in English literature, because it was assumed that I would, being of Jamaican heritage, know how to speak it and speak it well. And I think potentially the teacher was thinking, better it not come from anybody else so as to not offend. Rose will probably be the best person in this space to do the best job at this, but you can see why that is also problematic. So I think steering away from trying to think about who in this immediate space can do justice to this language and thinking about authenticity, going back to what Zahida says, authenticity, trying to look for resources that get you to the authentic root of who produced that language and whose voice should kind of be speaking that out into the space, I think is a really important way to go.
Thanks, Rose. And I notice Ashley's comment in the chat as well. Thank you for sharing that, Ashley. Is there anything you'd like to add, Ashley, or elaborate from your comment in the chat?
Thank you. Obviously, it's a great, rich discussion that's going on here. One question I've got, and obviously it's just building on something that's already been said. So currently, just as a side note, again, that it's I'm studying my PhD at Cambridge and looking at students' attitudes towards reading aloud in the classroom, which is obviously linking strongly to what's kind of the discussion, how that's taken a new twist. The only thing I'd say is, obviously, I think there's an argument for both senses. On the one sense, using the technology to have the actual poet talking about their own poetry and in their voice. Equally, I think sometimes it can be quite useful to have a teacher of any ethnicity reading aloud that poem, placing, you know, obviously, well, I'm white. I teach at a predominantly white school. There is more diversity coming through, which is absolutely fantastic. And obviously, we've spoken about John Agard. I think sometimes me reading that or having students read that can open up a fantastic discussion about putting a minority voice through a majority lens, if that makes sense. So me feeling perhaps a little bit uncomfortable, talking to a group of students that maybe there may be only one or two students that are ethnically diverse in the group, and then we can start talking about what is it that John Agard is actually trying to achieve here, rather than talking too much about the kind of getting caught up on perhaps the accent or anything like that, and talking about it in those terms, just thinking about maybe those bringing those diverse voices to the forefront of that discussion, if that makes sense. So that it's not really a question or anything like that. It's just something that I think is really, really important to consider on both counts. I think sometimes it's appropriate and sometimes it's not. And I think the teaching profession hopefully gets it right on the long run.
There is a brilliant book by Rachel Gilmore, which is called Bad English. And it's specifically about the way that a lot of Black and ethnic minority poets, but also other writers, play with language, and that their poems are metalinguistic, and John Agard is a good example, actually, is that he does focus on the words and bring you back to this question about, you know, the word I'm using and the fact that you're and I mean Tom Leonard is the same, actually, going back to that other one, and I think one poet who I'd really strongly recommend for use with anyone really to think about these things is Daljit Nagra, who has written a huge number of different poems which address this from other places, from different angles. There's a brilliant one in which he reflects about, in the voice of an elder of the Muslim community. It reflects on being in the Poetry from Other Cultures anthology that his kid has brought home, and he's like, what, they all think we're slaughtering goats now, what is this? Kind of absolutely brilliant satire of the whole concept. So I mean, I think it would be a shame not to think about those kind of metalinguistic playfulness that is a feature of so much of that poetry, and to acknowledge that skillfulness.
Right, thanks very much, Velda. I think we're drawing close to the end of our time for the webinar. I just had one question I'd like to share with the panel about research. So obviously we're here under the auspices of a research association, and I just wondered, just thinking, Velda, of your comment where you quoted around the idea of imagining differently, and I've thought about that sort of approach in terms of research, in the sense of, in education, we've had through the DFE that emphasis on what works, which strikes me as you know, an idea which inherently means we don't look beyond what we think works, and actually much of your research shows we don't understand what works, or you know, we're you know, everything that you're looking into means that, you know, things should certainly work differently and should be imagined differently. I just wondered if there's anything you could share about the context of research, your experience of conducting this research, because clearly it's incredibly important and you have traction and influence with your research. I just wondered if there's anything you would share on that, or any advice you'd share with colleagues about researching in this field in particular.
My advice is to get Penguin to get their fantastic and brilliant designer to do the design for the publication. I mean, I'm not even joking. I think that has been a huge part of the traction of this report, was the absolutely brilliant job that colleagues at Penguin and the freelance designer did on this, because actually that's what captures the imagination, isn't it? We're all about impact in research, and I think in this particular case, it has to come from people, from children, from teachers, because it's not going to come from the government. And I think that there, yeah. Sorry, that's not a very helpful response, but it's actually quite serious.
No, but I think
see how that matters. Yeah. Sorry, Rose.
So I think you touched on something, because I'm just remembering some conversations that that we have, Velda, where you were basically like, Rose, you need to cut this, you need to cut this down, and you were constantly reminding me like our audience is going to be wide reaching, and this is for sort of like public publication, and like hence the visual nature of it. And so it meant that kind of thinking about the public nature and the fact that it was a Penguin report rather than sort of like a research report that I was used to writing, meant that I had to kind of think about the research and how it was going to be out in the public domain and in visual in like a very different way. And it meant that my writing style kind of changed in terms of length, in terms of the language that I was using. I was trying really hard to be way more accessible than maybe I have been in the past with my language use. So I remember just from comments that Velda gave on some drafts of some of the write-ups, it made me think about, actually, this is going to be like a very public research output and offering that we primarily wanted school leaders, school teachers and students to be able to pick up and run with. And so it meant that from a linguistic point of view, it had to really kind of capture people and speak to them and speak to a particular moment in time as well, in a way that maybe I hadn't previously done in other research reports I'd done in the past.
And that's so important, isn't it? And it's something that I don't think is thought about enough in general when it comes to research. That there's so much educational research that happens that isn't read beyond other researchers. And actually, if we want to make a change in the world of education, we need to have teachers who are reading our research. And actually, if you can just make a few changes by changing the way that the language that you use in a report or making it more visual, means that it's going to be more accessible to teachers. That's actually huge. It's a kind of a small change. Well, maybe it wasn't that small. I'm sure there was a lot of work went into it, but you know, as a concept, it's really important, I think.
Thanks, Sarah. And just before we conclude, I suppose one thing that strikes me from the discussions today is that much of what you've described suggests that, as well as the texts for study themselves and those issues of teacher preparation, that there's of course something around the curriculum as well, which I know you do explore in the report as well, and even challenging or commenting on the idea of the term decolonising the curriculum as well. But in terms of the curriculum we have at the moment, you know, maybe there need to be some significant changes in terms of how we frame the English curriculum, particularly around literature, and you know, clearly the issue of identity is really key. How we frame that relative to subject English, varieties of English is of course something we've touched on through the afternoon as well, and also literary value as well. I wonder if there's any final comment each of you would like to make, or anything you'd like to make other members of the webinar aware of in terms of ongoing activity or things coming up maybe across the next year.
Yeah, I'd just like to maybe shout out to what Velda already mentioned in terms of the research that we're doing with Pearson Edexcel, who are very much ahead of the game when it came to changing the curriculum, and the qualitative research, which we're hoping, I think, to see results in 2024, Velda. I think that would be really exciting because that's kind of unprecedented, and this is the information that we can then build on and just create more change. So yeah, excited about that.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much. Any further comment on behalf of the Lit in Colour team or Sarah? Okay, well, in that case, thank you very much for your contributions today, and for supporting such a rich discussion. And thank you other members of BERA who've joined us this evening to join the discussion as well. I'm sure you found it stimulating, thought-provoking, and of course for optimism as well. You know, that we have things we can take away and act on as a result of these discussions. And I hope that we'll be able to continue these discussions, maybe with another webinar in future, perhaps over the next academic year or beyond, to follow the progress of Lit in Colour and the impacts and also of Sarah's work as well. And of course, other colleagues here, I'm sure, are engaged in either practice or research relating to these themes. So again, do let us know about your work so that we can all together, join together in that community discussion in future as well. So thanks ever so much for your contributions, everyone. Thanks also to Juliet from BERA, who has been ensuring the smooth running of this event as well. Thanks ever so much, Juliet. And yeah, have a good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the support you've offered for the event today, for the SIG, for BERA, and obviously for the focus of the research discussed this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.